Hey everyone. Tonight we step into the strange, uncomfortable, and occasionally horrifying world of medieval medicine. A world where diagnosing pregnancy relied more on superstition than science. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always amazing to see how far this little community reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and settle in. Because if you think modern medicine can be confusing, imagine living in a world where good health meant keeping your 4 bodily fluids in emotional harmony. Medieval Europe believed every person was basically a walking soup: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If any of those ingredients got moody, congratulations, you were sick, cursed, or possibly possessed. Doctors had no microscopes, no knowledge of germs, and only a passing relationship with hygiene. Their main qualifications were a robe, some Latin, and an absolutely terrifying level of confidence. They diagnosed everything: gout, heartbreak, demonic influence, by holding your wrist and pretending to feel destiny. Pregnancy, of course, was just another mystery, solved by creative improvisation and somebody else's bodily fluids. When a woman suspected she might be pregnant, the local physician, meaning the guy who owned a few jars, would arrive like a prophet. He'd ask a few grave questions, squint thoughtfully at her color, and declare he needed a sample, which meant urine, because medieval medicine always came back to pee. They treated urine like the body's autobiography, its color, texture, and smell revealing secrets from the soul. If it looked lively, pregnant. If it looked dull, not pregnant. If it contained frogs, well, witchcraft. Most doctors back then lived by one simple rule: why not? If it sounded mystical, it was good science. They believed the womb was a wandering creature that roamed around a woman's body, causing mood swings or even fainting spells. One 14th century text claimed you could lure it back to its place with pleasant aromas, which raises serious questions about what counted as pleasant. Still, you can't blame them too much. They were working blind, no hormones, no microscopes, no real idea of how anything worked beyond baking bread. What they lacked in accuracy, they made up for in flair. Confidence was half the cure. Among the many strange tests for pregnancy, none was more popular or more agricultural than the wheat and barley test. It was simple, cheap, and thoroughly disgusting. The woman would urinate on 2 small piles of grain, 1 wheat and 1 barley, and everyone would wait a few days. If either pile sprouted, she was declared pregnant. If both sprouted, even better, maybe twins, or a blessing from heaven. If neither sprouted, she was barren, cursed, or just dehydrated. According to 14th century texts, barley sprouting first meant a boy, wheat meant a girl. So in a sense, they invented the first gender reveal, centuries before colored smoke and exploding balloons. It's strangely poetic, really. Life detecting life. People gathered around a damp patch of cereal, waiting for signs of destiny. They believed a pregnant woman's urine carried the essence of new life, a magical vapor that could wake seeds from their sleep. Biology by metaphor, and somehow, against all odds, there's a grain of truth in it. Modern science has found that elevated estrogen during pregnancy can slightly accelerate germination. So yes, it might have worked if you ignore the part where people kept jars of urine in their kitchens for a week and called it divine revelation. Imagine the husband saying, "Darling, The barley's sprouting. Wonderful, she replies. Now please throw it away before it gains consciousness. For medieval Europe, though, this was high-tech medicine, affordable, visual, and impressively agricultural. And when in doubt, that was the European solution to everything: infection, heartbreak, anxiety, and apparently pregnancy testing. The method was simple: mix a woman's urine with wine and wait. If the mixture stayed clear, she was pregnant. If it turned cloudy or curdled, she wasn't. Somewhere, a priest probably nodded approvingly. This, at least, sounded like chemistry. The logic went that wine's purity would only react to healthy, divinely charged fluids. Pregnancy, they said, filled the woman's body with sacred life essence, so her urine wouldn't spoil the wine. The process had style: pour, swirl, comment on the aroma, robust, with notes of anxiety, and declare a result. It wasn't science, but it sure looked like it. And to be fair, modern studies do show alcohol can react with certain proteins in urine, sometimes hinting at pregnancy. But in medieval Europe, the only consistent result was nausea. Still, it looked professional, and in those days, looking professional was half the medicine. And then there was the onion test, possibly the most disturbing of all. Originating in ancient Egypt, it traveled through Greece and eventually reached medieval Europe, where people embraced it with far too much enthusiasm. A woman who suspected she was pregnant was told to insert a peeled onion, or sometimes a clove of garlic, overnight. In the morning, the physician, or worse, her husband, would check her breath. If her breath smelled of onion, the womb was open, meaning no pregnancy. If it didn't, the womb was closed, meaning she was expecting. It's hard to overstate how bizarre that logic was. They believed the womb was connected to the mouth, a literal tunnel through the body, like a biological hallway. In modern terms, if you can smell it upstairs, the basement's fine. Some doctors even ranked how much the smell traveled, claiming to measure conception by degrees of aroma, from lightly scented to sealed by divine will. And somehow, this made perfect sense to them. Ancient texts described the womb as a living, wandering creature that could move around the body, causing hysteria, fainting, or onion-free breath. The cure, naturally, was fragrance therapy: lure the womb back with pleasant smells below and repel it with foul ones near the nose. Medicine at its most interpretive, you can almost picture the poor woman trying not to laugh while some man with bad Latin declared her sealed with mystery. Medieval medicine was equal parts curiosity and catastrophe, a mix of superstition, confidence, and some very patient women. They didn't have science, or even soap, but they had imagination. And in a world where wine, onions, and barley counted as medical equipment, maybe that was the closest thing they had to hope. For some, the test might have been mildly humiliating. For others, downright terrifying. But for medieval physicians, it was just another day diagnosing life through vegetables. And honestly, in the Grand Museum of Medieval Medicine, the onion test deserves its own exhibit, preferably far away from the air conditioning. By the late Middle Ages, that charming little experiment evolved, or, depending on how you see it, mutated into a new and improved version, the garlic breath test. Because, if there's one thing humanity has always excelled at, it's doubling down on a bad idea and making it smell worse. The method was almost identical. Take a clove of garlic, insert it somewhere garlic has no business being, and wait overnight. In the morning, a trained professional, and I use that term as generously as possible, would lean in close and sniff the woman's breath. If the scent of garlic wafted upward, her body was open, meaning not pregnant. If there was no trace of garlic, congratulations, she was expecting, and probably never kissing her husband again. The reasoning, as always, was delightfully insane. Medieval doctors believed air flowed freely through a woman's body, mouth, lungs, heart, womb, all connected in one long, continuous hallway. The garlic test, then, was basically a plumbing inspection. If the vapors reached the mouth, the pipeline was clear. If not, something or someone was blocking the passage. Equal parts superstition and early anatomy lesson. It was medicine built on the confidence of men who had never seen an actual uterus, and yet they wrote about it with total authority. One physician declared, "The scent, if passing unimpeded, showeth the womb to be void." Translation: I have no idea what's happening, but I'm sure it sounds profound. This wasn't some obscure village ritual, either it appeared in real medical texts and was passed down for centuries. Even Renaissance doctors, those self-proclaimed men of science, kept the garlic theory alive. Apparently, progress smells like lunch. Of course, not everyone used garlic. Some preferred onions, leeks, even rose petals, a gentler version for the delicate, which means that in medieval Europe, you could walk into a doctor's office and come out smelling like a salad. But when vegetables failed to reveal the truth, medicine turned to metal. Enter the metal reaction test, a dignified experiment that, unsurprisingly, involved urine. Because apparently, no one in the Middle Ages ever got tired of staring at it under different lighting conditions. The process was simple. Collect a woman's urine, pour it over a piece of metal, lead, tin, maybe bronze, and wait. If the metal darkened, corroded, or changed color, the woman was declared pregnant. If nothing happened, she wasn't. And if the metal started smoking, that was either divine intervention or early lead poisoning. The reasoning went that pregnancy altered the purity of a woman's fluids, and that metals, being noble elements, would instinctively react to this sacred change. It was chemistry before chemistry, or more accurately, before understanding anything about chemistry. The idea that God's favorite metals could detect a fetus was both profoundly poetic and profoundly stupid. Naturally, the results were inconsistent. Some metals tarnished instantly, others not at all. And occasionally the doctor would simply announce, "It has a sheen most divine," and hand over the bill. The test's reliability depended entirely on the humidity, the quality of the metal, and how long the physician was willing to stare at a pot of pee. Still, in its own strange way, the metal test hinted at a new curiosity, the beginning of alchemy. It was a time when science and mysticism were still roommates who refused to set boundaries. Everything from mercury to moonlight was believed to hold hidden meaning. If a stone could turn to gold, surely a woman's urine could reveal a soul in progress. And while it's easy to laugh now, there's something oddly admirable about that determination. They genuinely wanted answers. They just didn't have microscopes, thermometers, or the faintest clue what a uterus actually did. And because the medieval mind loved symbolism, fire for purity, light for truth, and urine because, well, unavoidable, someone decided to combine all three. Thus was born the candle test, humanity's first attempt to turn pregnancy detection into a seance. The setup was dramatic. Take a pot of urine, light a candle, hold it above the surface, and watch. If the flame flickered, the woman was pregnant. If it burned steady, she wasn't. And if it went out completely, well, either she wasn't pregnant or the doctor had just discovered suffocation. This wasn't a folk ritual. Educated physicians performed it. Men with robes, titles, and zero understanding of combustion. They believed pregnancy released subtle vapors, invisible emanations of new life that would rise from the body and make the flame tremble. If the candle danced, the womb was stirring with divine activity. If not, maybe next time. Picture the scene. A medieval doctor hunched over a glowing candle, muttering Latin, while a poor woman sits nearby, watching her own bodily fluids simmer gently in a brass pot. It's the kind of image that makes you profoundly grateful for the invention of the laboratory. In theory, it was poetic. Light, revealing life, fire, answering flesh. In practice, it was nonsense. Results depended entirely on drafts, humidity, and how bored the physician was. Many women were likely declared pregnant because someone opened a window. But in that world, the flicker of a flame was sacred truth. To them, pregnancy wasn't a biological event, it was cosmic. If a candle danced, it wasn't physics, it was the soul making its debut performance. And yet, of all the strange ideas, few were as mystical or as physically uncomfortable as the key and dream method. Half science, half witchcraft, and 100% nonsense. A woman suspecting pregnancy would sleep with a metal key under her pillow. In the morning, she'd recount her dreams. If she dreamed of children, light, or fertility, congratulations, she was pregnant. If she dreamed of storms, demons, or locked doors, the womb was barren. Essentially, it was Freud, but with more iron. In some regions, the key wasn't under the pillow at all. It was tied to the thigh or placed on the stomach, because nothing says restful sleep like being gently stabbed by your own diagnostic tool. The logic was symbolic. Keys unlocked mysteries, and so, in theory, they could unlock the truth of the womb. The mind and body, they believed, were connected, sisters in secrecy, which sounds beautiful until you remember it was written by men who thought sneezing could cause miscarriage. Still, compared to onions and urine, this was one of the better options. No smells, no jars, no candles, just a key, a night's rest, and a morning full of dream interpretation. Of course, dreams being dreams, results varied wildly. I dreamed of a goose stealing bread could mean either twins or demonic interference. Each physician had his own theory. One said dreaming of water meant pregnancy. Another said the same dream meant digestive problems. The only constant was confusion, but it revealed something telling about the medieval mind, a desperate desire to find order in chaos, to turn mystery into metaphor. They wanted meaning, even if they had to invent it. And if the key test failed, well, they could always blame the rust. Eventually, though, the fascination with fluids returned, because for a civilization obsessed with them, it was inevitable that someone would say, "Forget the urine, let's look at the blood." And so came one of the more dramatic and unhygienic tests of the era, the blood drop omen. It began, as all good medieval medical procedures did, with a sharp object and misplaced confidence. The physician would prick the woman's arm, collect a few drops of blood, and drip them into a bowl of water. Then everyone would lean in to watch, because in an age without Netflix, this was peak entertainment. If the blood spread gracefully through the water, she was pregnant. If it clumped, that meant a girl. If it sank, despair. If it floated, congratulations, though probably for the wrong reason. It was messy, meaningless, and entirely medieval, but it captures the spirit of the time. a world groping for truth, with one hand on a candle, the other holding garlic, and absolutely no idea how any of it actually worked. The doctor would likely claim divine confirmation and charge extra. It was medicine meets tea leaf reading, only with more anemia. The logic, once again, was poetic nonsense. Physicians believed pregnancy purified the mother's blood, making it lighter and more heavenly. Blood that sank was thought to be tainted by sin, melancholy, or last night's dinner. In short, your entire reproductive fate could hinge on whether your doctor sneezed near a water bowl. Sometimes, of course, the test went wrong. The blood behaved unpredictably, as blood tends to do, and doctors were forced to improvise. Some blamed evil spirits. Others accused the patient of lying. One even claimed the blood was shy. Truly, the scientific method at work. And yet, the ritual had gravitas. There was something sacred about blood, life's red signature. To watch it dance in water was, in their eyes, to glimpse creation itself. It was messy, yes, but so was childbirth. To them, it all fit together somehow. Still, one can only imagine the poor women who sat through this process, bleeding into bowls, while a robed man squinted at the results and murmured, "Ah, yes, very buoyant." If you were a medieval woman and managed to escape the jars, onions, garlic, and bloodletting, there was still one more diagnostic gauntlet waiting for you, the eye test. No tools, no herbs, no incantations, just a man staring directly into your face until one of you blinked. According to medical texts of the 13th and 14th centuries, pregnancy could be detected simply by observing the eyes. In the first months, one scholar wrote confidently, "Her gaze softens, her pupils grow dim, and there is a sparkle of moisture." Another claimed the veins in her eyes grew red and dancing. A third added that her eyes shone with the secret fire of creation, which sounds poetic until you realize it's just medieval, for she looks tired. The logic was straightforward if you were from the 1200s and had never seen biology before. Physicians believed the eyes were mirrors of the soul, and since a pregnant woman carried a second soul, her eyes must reflect too. Simple math, also wrong. In practice, the test involved a lot of intense staring. Picture a bearded doctor leaning close, candlelight flickering between you, muttering about divine moisture. Most women probably felt less examined and more haunted. And yet, somehow, this passed for medicine. The test was particularly popular with educated doctors, the kind who wore silk hoods, charged obscene amounts, and quoted Aristotle incorrectly. For them, staring into a patient's eyes was preferable to dealing with her actual body, which, as everyone knew, was terrifying and full of mysteries. It also had social convenience. No undressing, no urine jars, no garlic. Just look here, madame, followed by a long pause and a solemn declaration like, "Yes, I see the spark of motherhood." Translation: "I've stared long enough. Please pay me." So yes, the eye test may have been one of the least invasive pregnancy methods of the Middle Ages, but it was also the creepiest job description ever written. Professional eye contact specialist, part-time prophet. While the men of medicine brewed potions, lit candles over pots of urine, and pretended to understand Latin, the real experts were already at work, the midwives. These women didn't need onions, barley, or blood bowls. They had experience, observation, and an unshakable sense of when someone was lying about just being bloated. Medieval midwives had seen it all. "Hey, were the unsung field researchers of an age that didn't believe in data but loved gossip. While doctors wrote theories about the essence of life, midwives were the ones catching it, usually while standing in smoky cottages, elbows deep in someone else's miracle. Their pregnancy tests were simple and far more reliable than anything the universities devised. They felt pulses, noted skin tone, studied a woman's walk, and paid attention to cravings and fatigue. They could often detect pregnancy weeks before any doctor's candle flickered or barley sprouted, and they didn't need garlic to do it. Of course, their accuracy made them suspicious. Men in authority were baffled by the idea that someone without a beard could know things they didn't. The church often accused midwives of witchcraft because clearly anyone that competent must be in league with Satan. One midwife even said, "The womb tells me what the woman cannot." For a 14th century cleric, that was basically a confession of sorcery. Yet despite persecution, these women persisted. They treated generations of mothers, often for bread instead of coin. They relied on intuition, a sharp eye, and centuries of oral tradition passed from woman to woman, and they were usually right. Ironically, the midwives, not the scholars or priests, represented the first real science of pregnancy: observation, pattern recognition, and practical knowledge, all the things universities refused to admit mattered. By the late Middle Ages, analyzing urine had become a full-fledged profession, not a side hobby, but a career. Practitioners were known as uroscopists, the rock stars of medieval diagnostics. These men strutted through towns in velvet robes, carrying crystal flasks filled with other people's fluids, and somehow convinced everyone this was respectable. Their method revolved around one sacred object, the flask of urine or medulla. They'd hold it to the light, swirl it like wine, and examine color, clarity, bubbles, and omens. Pale yellow meant health, reddish, fever, cloudy, pregnancy, black, your soul's already leaving. Uroscopists even published urine-colored charts, 40 shades of yellow, that made them look like medieval interior designers. They'd point to hopeful gold or sorrowful brown, pretending the human bladder was a paint sample from Divine Home Depot. What's more, you didn't even need to meet them. You could send your urine by courier, yes, mail-order medicine in the 1300s, and receive a handwritten diagnosis, no refund policy included. Some claimed they could tell not only if a woman was pregnant, but what kind of child she carried, cheerful, strong, or melancholic, because, apparently, urine had personality. Of course, frauds were everywhere. Some bought fake degrees, some memorized color charts, and some just nodded wisely, no matter what they saw. "Your urine shows great complexity," they'd say. Medieval, for I have no idea. Still, people trusted them. In a world without labs, the medulla was the closest thing to a microscope. A sincere, if misguided attempt to read the body through what it discarded. Crude, yes. Gross, definitely. But it was the Middle Ages trying, one flask at a time. Eventually, the church noticed. People were boiling urine under candles, sleeping on keys, and stuffing onions into places better left unstuffed. In a world where God supposedly controlled everything, the clergy didn't appreciate amateurs running biology experiments. Clerics called these tests vain curiosities. Medieval, for stop meddling with God's business. Only divine will was meant to reveal life in the womb. To confirm it yourself, especially using garlic, was seen as pride or even sorcery, because clearly Satan, as greatest plan for humanity, was teaching women to recognize a missed period. Pregnancy, in the Church's view, was sacred mystery. The Virgin Mary had set the bar impossibly high, and the clergy wasn't here about to let the average woman's anatomy become a public guessing game. So priests condemned many methods, especially those that looked ritualistic: wine and urine, possibly witchcraft, sprouting barley, pagan candle tests, heresy with better lighting. But medieval Europe, being what it was, the prohibition only made them more popular. The Church's disapproval gave these tests a whiff of forbidden knowledge, which, for some women, was preferable to another sermon on chastity. Midwives, already under suspicion for knowing too much, continued their work in secret, caught between religion and reason. It was in that the Church opposed medicine altogether. They simply disliked any process that bypassed the priestly middleman. If you were sick, you confessed. If you were dying, you confessed faster. But pregnancy, that required no sin, no confession, and therefore no revenue. It was the ultimate theological loophole. In fairness, the Church wasn't entirely wrong. Most medieval pregnancy tests were unscientific, unsanitary, and occasionally fatal. But in suppressing them, the Church also delayed genuine discovery. What followed was an uneasy truce between faith and curiosity. The devout prayed for divine signs, while the curious peered into bowls of urine, hoping to see life reflected back. For 1,000 years, medicine existed in this limbo, half faith, half fumes, and entirely human. Every so often, though, something miraculous emerged from the madness of superstition that, against all odds, sort of worked. Take the barley and wheat test, for instance, the one where women urinated on seeds to see if they sprouted. Modern science has since found a grain of truth in that ritual. Estrogen in pregnant women, urine, can indeed stimulate germination. Without realizing it, medieval peasants had stumbled upon one of the earliest forms of biological testing, centuries before laboratories or microscopes existed. They had, quite accidentally, invented the pregnancy test and then promptly buried it under garlic, ritual, and theology. Even the infamous wine test, the medieval habit of mixing urine with wine and calling it medicine, wasn't entirely nonsense. Alcohol does react with certain proteins and hormones found in the urine of pregnant women. It was never accurate, but it worked just enough to keep people trying and perhaps to justify drinking on the job. Again and again, superstition tripped over science. The Middle Ages were full of clues, chemical, biological, and physical, but without the means to interpret them. People turned every experiment into ceremony. They were, in their way, performing science. They just didn't know it. Each test was a strange fusion of faith, intuition, and trial and error. If it worked twice, it was holy truth. If it failed, it was the devil's fault. Peer review meant shouting Latin louder than your colleagues. And yet, through that fog of incense and ignorance, small sparks of truth survived. This overlap between belief and biology became the unlikely cradle of medical progress. It taught Europe that the human body could be studied even if early conclusions were spectacularly wrong. Those clumsy experiments with urine and barley slowly evolved into chemistry, anatomy, and eventually pharmacology. By the dawn of the Renaissance, people were finally beginning to realize that perhaps garlic breath and boiling urine weren't the cornerstones of modern science. But progress in the Middle Ages was never smooth. It was a slow, muddy shuffle forward, like someone trying to cross a field while holding a candle and a theory. The old ways didn't vanish overnight. The barley jars, the blood bowls, and the urine flasks lingered in remote villages long after scholars rediscovered Greek anatomy and, inconveniently, common sense. What changed was attitude. Curiosity stopped being heresy. People began to ask why instead of who cursed me. Alchemists became chemists. Herbalists evolved into pharmacists. And the wandering womb was finally given a permanent address. The human body stopped being a divine mystery and became a puzzle, still gross, still complicated, but at least one that could be studied without a priest breathing down your neck. By the 19th century, science finally caught up to what superstition had been hinting at all along. The first reliable pregnancy tests used animal urine and hormones, an oddly sophisticated descendant of the barley jar, just with lab coats instead of aprons. By the mid-20th century, the little white plastic stick appeared, discreet, clinical, and mercifully free of onions. And yet, for all our progress, the ritual remains the same. You still urinate on something and wait for it to reveal your future. The difference is that now it's sterile, private, and blessedly free of candlelight and theological commentary. Looking back, it's easy to mock the medieval world for its absurdities. But beneath the superstition and bad hygiene lies something profoundly human. They were guessing, experimenting, and hoping just with worse lighting and no soap. Their failures, however messy, paved the long and winding road that led us here to the quiet certainty of a small blue line. The year was 1604. And the air in England was thick with tension, whispers, and fear. King James I sat on the throne, a Protestant ruler in a land still bleeding from the scars of religious war. For decades, Catholics had been hunted, tortured, and silenced, their faith forced underground, their hope burning in secret places. And in those dark, hidden corners of London, among the faithful who dared to dream of freedom, a dangerous idea was beginning to take shape, a plot so bold it would shake the kingdom to its core. Robert Catesby, a man of conviction and fury, could no longer bear to watch his people suffer. He had lost everything, his father to persecution, his faith to secrecy, his wealth to fines that punished him for believing differently. In his heart, he carried one desperate thought: if the government would not listen, then it must burn. Catesby's eyes burned with a holy fire as he gathered a few trusted friends in a quiet inn on the outskirts of London. The room was dimly lit, the sound of rain tapping against the window like a heartbeat. "We have begged, we have prayed," he said in a low, trembling voice. "And yet they call us traitors for worshipping God our way. I say no more. I say we strike at the very heart of tyranny. We strike at Parliament itself." The men exchanged glances. Thomas Wintour, cautious but loyal, leaned forward. "Strike Parliament," he whispered. "With what?" Catesby's lips curled into a grim smile. "With fire. With gunpowder." The silence that followed was heavy and electric. It was madness, treason, and destiny all at once. They knew the price: death by hanging, drawing, and quartering, but the dream of seeing England free from persecution burned brighter than fear. Soon the group began to grow. There was Thomas Percy, a nobleman with royal connections; John Wright, a swordsman with fierce courage; and later, Christopher Wright, his brother. But there was one missing piece, someone who could make this dream explode into reality. That man was Guy Fawkes. Fawkes was unlike anyone they had met. Born in York, he had left England years ago to fight for the Spanish army in Flanders, a Catholic warrior hardened by war. His face was calm, his eyes steady, and his heart unshaken. When Thomas Wintour found him abroad and spoke of Catesby's plan, Fawkes listened in silence. Then, with a quiet nod, he said the words that sealed his fate. "I will join you." He was the expert they needed, a man who understood gunpowder, who knew how to make it roar like thunder and destroy stone. By the summer of 1604, the plan had begun. The conspirators rented a small house near the Palace of Westminster. From there, they started digging a tunnel beneath Parliament, planning to place barrels of gunpowder directly under the House of Lords. Day after day, they worked in darkness, the sound of picks echoing through the damp earth, their sweat mixing with fear and determination. But the work was slow and dangerous. The ground was hard, and London was filled with soldiers and spies. Every creak, every footstep above them made their hearts race. Still, they pressed on, dreaming of the moment when Parliament would be nothing but smoke and rubble, when King James, his ministers, and the entire government would vanish in one deafening explosion. But fate, as always, had other plans. Months passed, and the tunnel remained unfinished. Then, in March 1605, they heard news that changed everything. A cellar directly under the House of Lords was available for rent. It was perfect, a gift from fate itself. Thomas Percy quickly arranged to lease it, using his connections at court. Under the name of John Johnson, Guy Fawkes took charge of the cellar. Slowly, secretly, the group began transporting barrels of gunpowder into the chamber, hiding them under piles of firewood. 36 barrels in total, enough to shatter the entire building to dust. The plan was simple but terrifying in its precision. On the 5th of November, when the King and the members of Parliament would gather for the state opening, Guy Fawkes would light the fuse and vanish into the night. In a single breath, centuries of oppression would be avenged. As the day drew closer, the conspirators met often, their voices hushed, their faces tense. Catesby spoke of faith and destiny, of sacrifice and divine justice. He believed their act would awaken England, bring the Catholic faith back to glory. But others began to worry. What about the innocent? What about the Catholics who worked in Parliament, or the nobles who did not deserve to die? The question hung heavy over them. But Catesby's resolve was unbreakable. "This is war," he said coldly, "and in war the innocent fall." Yet the guilt festered. One of the conspirators, Francis Tresham, had family in Parliament, and fear began to eat at him. He pleaded with Catesby to call off the plan, to find another way. But Catesby refused. "We are too deep," he said. "There is no turning back now." Still, Tresham's conscience would not let him rest, and it was his next action that would doom them all. On the night of October 26, 1605, Lord Monteagle, a nobleman with ties to the conspirators, received a mysterious letter. It warned him not to attend the opening of Parliament. "They shall receive a terrible blow, this Parliament," it read, "and yet they shall not see who hurts them." Monteagle was alarmed. He took the letter straight to the King's chief minister, Robert Cecil. At first, Cecil suspected a prank, but something about the phrasing, "a terrible blow," made his blood run cold. The King himself, when shown the letter, instantly thought of gunpowder. Orders were given to search the cellars beneath Parliament. For a few days, nothing happened. The conspirators waited nervously, unaware that the noose was tightening around them. Then, on the night of November 4th, just hours before the explosion was meant to happen, a group of guards entered the cellar. There, among the barrels of firewood, they found a man, tall, quiet, dressed in a cloak and boots. He gave his name calmly, John Johnson. But when they searched him, they found fuses, matches, and a watch to time the explosion. The man did not flinch, even as swords were drawn, even as he was bound and dragged away. His expression did not change. Guy Fawkes had been caught. News spread like wildfire. The king rejoiced, the court erupted in celebration, and the word Gunpowder Plot burned across England. Fawkes was taken to the Tower of London, where the interrogations began. They tortured him brutally, stretching him on the rack until his joints cracked, beating him until his body was broken. Still, he refused to speak. "You cannot make me betray my friends," he whispered through clenched teeth. But pain, endless and unbearable, has a way of breaking even the strongest soul. After days of agony, he finally revealed their names. The hunt began. Across England, the conspirators fled. Catesby, the Wright brothers, Percy, all running from the crown's wrath. They rode through the countryside, hoping to gather allies, to spark rebellion. But their dream was already dead. Villagers turned them away. Soldiers hunted them down. Finally, cornered at Holbeck House, the last of the conspirators made their stand. Rain poured outside as muskets fired. Catesby clutched a picture of the Virgin Mary, whispering a final prayer. A bullet struck him in the chest, throwing him backward. As he fell, a faint smile crossed his lips, not of victory, but of peace. He had failed, but he had tried. When soldiers entered the house, they found the bodies of the men who had dreamed of fire and freedom. The Gunpowder Plot was over. In London, Guy Fawkes, half alive and broken, faced his execution. On the morning of January 31st, 1606, he was dragged through the streets, the crowd shouting curses. As he climbed the gallows, he looked out over the sea of faces. There was no fear left in him, only silence. In one final act of defiance, he leaped from the scaffold before the hangman could finish the job, snapping his own neck, denying them the satisfaction of watching him suffer. The crowd gasped. The legend was born. But the story did not end there. Every year since, on the 5th of November, England lights bonfires and burns effigies of Guy Fawkes, remembering the night the kingdom almost vanished in flames. What began as an act of rebellion became a symbol of betrayal, of faith twisted by desperation. Yet behind the smoke and fire, one truth remains, that when people are pushed too far, even the smallest spark can set the world ablaze. The ashes of rebellion had barely cooled when the king's men began their hunt, sweeping through the countryside like wolves. The Gunpowder Plot had failed, but its echoes were deafening. Fear gripped England. Whispers filled taverns and churches alike. The name Guy Fawkes became both a curse and a legend overnight. In London, the streets were alive with celebration. Bonfires burned bright, and people sang songs praising King James for his miraculous survival. But in the shadows, the hunt continued, and those who had dreamed of fire were being dragged one by one into the light. Thomas Wintour was captured first, wounded and bleeding, his spirit as broken as his body. He had fought until his sword shattered in his hand. They brought him back to London in chains, his face pale, eyes hollow. Beside him rode Ambrose Rookwood, whose wealth had funded much of the plan, and the brave John Grant, whose eyes had been burned blind by a gunpowder accident during their desperate flight. Each man knew what awaited them: the tower, the rack, and the gallows. When they arrived, the king's interrogators wasted no time. They wanted every detail: who helped, who funded, who else knew. But Wintour, like Fawkes, spoke little. He admitted the plot, but not the dream behind it. "We sought to end persecution," he whispered through cracked lips. "Not to murder for sport." But such words meant nothing now. To the Crown, these men were monsters. The trial began on January 27th, 1606, inside Westminster Hall, the very place they had planned to destroy. It was a cruel irony. The hall was packed with nobles, judges, and courtiers, all eager to see the faces of the men who had nearly erased them from history. The conspirators were brought in, shackled and pale. Their names were read aloud: Robert Winter, Thomas Winter, Ambrose Rookwood, John Grant, Sir Everard Digby, and the others. Guy Fawkes, still weak from torture, stood silent, his face drawn but his eyes steady. When asked for his defense, he spoke softly but clearly. "Our intent was to free our people from endless suffering. If that be treason, then I am guilty." The court roared in outrage. The sentence was already decided long before the trial began. They were to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, the most brutal death imaginable. The announcement filled the air with cold finality. No mercy, no forgiveness, only the lesson that rebellion against the king would be answered with blood. On the morning of January 30th, 1606, the first executions took place in St. Paul's churchyard. A huge crowd gathered, hungry for vengeance, their cheers echoing through the city. Sir Everard Digby, the nobleman who had once dined with kings, was the first to die. He mounted the scaffold with dignity, his voice calm as he addressed the crowd. "May God forgive me," he said, "and may he open your eyes to the cause we fought for." The hangman tightened the noose. Moments later, Digby's body swung lifelessly, and the crowd erupted. One by one, the others followed. Thomas Winter, Ambrose Rookwood, John Grant, their names fading into the cold air as their bodies were torn apart, displayed for all to see. The king's message was clear: treason will not be remembered as glory, only as shame. The next day, January 31st, it was Guy Fawkes's turn. The crowd was larger than ever. People climbed rooftops just to catch a glimpse of the man who had almost destroyed their world. Fawkes was dragged through the muddy streets, his body weak but his spirit unbroken. As he reached the scaffold, he looked at the sky, gray, heavy, unfeeling. A priest asked if he wished to repent. Fawkes gave a faint smile. "My only regret," he whispered, "is that it failed." Then, in one final act of defiance, he leaped from the platform, breaking his neck before the executioner could begin the gruesome ritual. The crowd gasped, and for a brief moment there was silence. The man who had planned to blow up Parliament had stolen his own ending. His body was still mutilated afterward, his remains scattered to prevent any chance of martyrdom. But legends are harder to destroy than flesh. In taverns and alleyways, people began to talk. Some called him a devil, others a hero. And slowly, in the years that followed, the name Guy Fawkes became something more than just a traitor's ghost. Yet the government moved quickly to erase any sympathy. Laws against Catholics tightened further. Priests were hunted. Secret masses were punished with death. King James ordered that every year, on the 5th of November, people must celebrate the foiling of the plot, a day of thanksgiving to God for saving England from destruction. Bells were rung. Bonfires were lit. Children carried torches through the streets, chanting, "Remember, remember, the 5th of November, gunpowder, treason, and plot." What began as a celebration of survival became a ritual of fear. a reminder of what happens when faith turns to fire. But beneath the cheers and the flames, not everyone felt triumph. Many Catholics, forced to watch the burning effigies, felt the sting of loss. They had dreamed of freedom, and now they were branded forever as enemies of the state. Families of the conspirators were stripped of land and title. Catesby's home was burned to the ground, his name erased from records. Yet in the quiet corners of England, people whispered his name with respect. He dared, they said, when no one else would. Decades passed. The 5th of November became an annual spectacle. Fireworks, parades, effigies of Fawkes thrown into the flames. Over time, the true reasons behind the plot faded into myth. To some, Guy Fawkes became the face of evil. To others, the face of rebellion. Children laughed as they tossed straw figures into bonfires, never realizing they were reenacting the death of a man who once believed he was fighting for justice. The government had turned a near tragedy into propaganda. Each year, the fire reminded people to obey, to fear, to never rise again. But history has a strange way of twisting back upon itself. Centuries later, as England changed, kings rose and fell. Revolutions swept across Europe. The image of Guy Fawkes began to transform. Writers and thinkers revisited the story, seeing in it not just treason, but tragedy. The poet John Milton wrote of the dangers of tyranny. Others saw Fawkes as a man who stood against oppression, not for glory, but for belief. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Guy Fawkes Night had become both celebration and satire. Masks of Fawkes's face were sold on street corners. Children begged for a penny for the guy, showing off their homemade effigies before tossing them into the fire. The man once feared as a traitor had become part of folklore, a ghost that refused to die. In time, even his image evolved. The long-nosed, mustached mask, first a crude caricature, later immortalized in art and print, became the face of resistance itself. When political unrest spread, when people rose against power, that face would reappear, grinning beneath the smoke. And so, the story of the Gunpowder Plot lived on, reshaped, retold, reborn. But in the beginning, in that cold winter of 1606, it was not legend, it was loss. Wives wept, children disappeared into poverty. The dream that Catesby had built on faith and fire was gone. In the tower, the last confessions were written, trembling lines of ink stained with guilt and pain. "God forgive us," Thomas Winter wrote before his death. "Our intent was not to destroy but to deliver. Yet, in our blindness, we lost both. History did not forgive them. The king's men destroyed every trace they could find. Letters burned, houses confiscated, names erased. But even then, the memory of that night refused to vanish. People would still pause every 5th of November to watch the flames rise, some with joy, others with quiet reflection. The sky would light up with sparks, and for a brief moment, England would remember the night the kingdom almost fell. The Gunpowder Plot was over, but its shadow stretched across centuries. It was a story of faith turned to fury, of hope turned to ash, and of men who dared to dream of freedom in a world that refused to let them breathe. In the flicker of every bonfire, their ghosts still danced, not as heroes, not as villains, but as reminders of what happens when oppression becomes too heavy for the human soul to bear. The faces in the fire were many Catesby's determined eyes, Fawkes's quiet defiance, Wintour's sorrow, Digby's regret. They were gone, but their story had only just begun. Because in every age, in every generation, there are those who look at power and whisper the same forbidden thought. What if it all burned? Centuries passed, but the fire never really died. The Gunpowder Plot had ended in blood, its conspirators broken, its dream buried beneath the weight of history. Yet every year, the 5th of November returned, bringing with it the scent of smoke and the glow of firelight. The bonfires burned in every corner of England, and the people chanted the same old words. Remember, remember, the 5th of November, gunpowder, treason, and plot. At first, it was a celebration of loyalty. The king had been saved, the traitors destroyed. But as generations turned and empires rose and fell, that same fire began to mean something else. The memory of Guy Fawkes became slippery, untamed. Some saw him as a warning, others as a question. Was he a villain, or a man who dared to fight for what he believed in when no one else would? By the 18th century, England was changing fast. The monarchy was no longer absolute. The people's voice was rising, and old fears were being replaced by new ones. In the streets, fireworks burst into the sky, children danced, and effigies of Guy Fawkes burned brighter each year. But behind the laughter, there was a strange kind of respect forming, an unspoken acknowledgement that the man they mocked might have stood for something more. Artists began painting him differently, not as a devil, but as a man of conviction. Pamphlets debated his motives, poets wrote of the last honest rebel, and quietly the story began to shift. By the 19th century, the night of the 5th had become less about the king's survival and more about defiance itself. The poor and the voiceless found something in Fawkes's memory that spoke to them. As the Industrial Revolution filled cities with smoke and sweat, the figure of Guy Fawkes became the face of rebellion, a man who had stood against a system that refused to listen. Bonfire Night turned from royal loyalty to public catharsis, a night when people could mock authority safely behind the mask of tradition. And then came the 20th century, a time when the world was torn apart by wars, dictators, and revolutions. In that chaos, the story of the Gunpowder Plot found new meaning again. Writers and filmmakers began retelling it, not as a failed act of terror, but as a symbol of resistance. In 1982, a writer named Alan Moore sat at his desk and imagined a world ruled by tyranny, a future where freedom was an illusion. And in that world, he resurrected a ghost from the past, Guy Fawkes. His creation, the masked vigilante known only as V, wore Fawkes's face, the wide grin, the sharp mustache, the mocking eyes. This time, the mask was not a symbol of failure, but of power. V did what Catesby and Fawkes could not. He lit the fuse, he made the Parliament burn, and as the flames rose, he spoke to the people. People should not be afraid of their governments. Governments should be afraid of their people. Those words would echo across decades. In 2005, the film V for Vendetta brought that mask to millions. Audiences around the world watched as the faceless rebel stood against corruption and control. The Guy Fawkes mask, once a tool of mockery, became a symbol of courage, of defiance, of every person who dared to stand up and say no. Soon it appeared everywhere. On the streets of London, during protests for freedom, in New York's Occupy movement, among crowds demanding justice, in Hong Kong, in Paris, in the Middle East, the same smiling mask stared out from behind barricades and across the glare of riot shields. The spirit of that long-dead plot had awakened, not in violence, but in voice. What began in 1605 as an explosion that never happened had transformed into something far more powerful, an idea. And ideas cannot be executed. They do not hang. They do not fade. The man called Guy Fawkes had failed to destroy a building, but he had unknowingly lit a fire that burned through time itself. Yet, if one could look back, if somehow the ghosts of those conspirators could see what their rebellion had become, what would they think? Perhaps Robert Catesby would still feel sorrow for the innocent lives they nearly destroyed, yet pride that their dream of freedom still lived on. Perhaps Guy Fawkes would stand in the crowd of masked faces, silent as always, watching his own image reflected in thousands of strangers who refused to kneel. The world had changed beyond anything they could imagine. The kings they once feared were gone, their power replaced by parliaments, corporations, and new forms of control. But the feeling, that burning ache for justice, that need to be heard, it was still the same. Every generation finds its tyrants, and every generation finds its Fawkes. As the centuries folded into one another, the 5th of November became more than a date. It became a mirror. For some, it reflected celebration, for others, warning. But for those who stood in the crowd and looked up at the burning effigy, it reflected a simple truth, that freedom, once lost, must always be fought for. The smell of gunpowder still fills the air every November night. The fire crackles, fireworks scream into the sky, and faces glow in orange light. Somewhere, a child asks who Guy Fawkes was, and a parent answers with half a smile. A man who tried to blow up the king, but the real answer lies deeper, buried beneath centuries of smoke and myth. Guy Fawkes was a man, not a hero, not a monster, but a believer. He believed that one act of fire could shatter injustice. He was wrong about the method, but not the message, because, even now, 400 years later, the world still burns with the same hunger, the need to be free. In the final moments of every bonfire night, when the last sparks fade and the crowd drifts home, the air grows quiet. The flames die, but the embers glow faintly, as if the earth itself is whispering his name. Guy Fawkes, the man who failed, the man who refused to bow, and in that failure lies his strange immortality. For what he tried to destroy became the very stage upon which his legend would rise. Parliament still stands, but his mask lives everywhere. In the face of the protester standing before tanks, in the artist painting walls with words of truth, in the hacker breaking silence with a message to the world. We are anonymous, we are legion, we do not forgive, we do not forget. Each mask is a spark, and together they form a fire far greater than the one Fawkes ever imagined. The old rhyme has changed meaning now. Remember, remember is no longer just a warning of treason, it's a reminder of power, the power of the people, the power of an idea. And so, the Gunpowder Plot, born in darkness, fed by faith, drowned in blood, found its resurrection, not in vengeance, but in remembrance. Its legacy is not the blast that never came, but the thought that did, that even one man, standing against impossible odds, can ignite centuries of change. The king's men tried to erase them. History tried to shame them. But time turned their story into something they could never have planned, a symbol that belongs not to religion or rebellion, but to every person who dreams of freedom. As the night sky glows above England, and the laughter of crowds echoes where the conspirators once plotted in secret, their story completes its circle. The fire that was meant to destroy became the light that endures. Somewhere in that flame, if you look closely enough, you can almost see him, the tall figure in the wide-brimmed hat, the faint smile beneath the mask, eyes reflecting the blaze. He doesn't speak. He doesn't need to. The fire speaks for him. It whispers the same words that have crossed centuries, carried on smoke and belief. Ideas are bulletproof.